these brief 10 minutes going to try and persuade you that microtransit can lead to the following three things for transit in rural areas. Firstly, a faster recovery once lockdown is lifted. Secondly, a better oversight of how people travel. And thirdly, transit that's more resilient to shocks in the future. So it's clear that ridership has tumbled since the start of COVID. Many of us have anecdotally experienced this and know that our transport systems have shut down. But even when the restrictions are eventually lifted, it's becoming clear that ridership will take quite a long time to recover. So 20% of people in a recent survey by Sistra, for example, said they'd make fewer trips on public transport than before, which is concerning for transit agencies. So the question for companies like ours is, how can we help turn the tide of declining transit ridership? And so in normal times, microtransit was rapidly adopted by many agencies across the world because it fills gaps in transit where it's economically not really that feasible to run fixed line buses. It uses advanced algorithms to simplify the planning and trip matching stages for operators, and usually use it on an app, which makes it a key part of any modern multimodal transportation system in cities. But all these things become even more important during a pandemic, really, because as ridership tumbles, agencies are realizing that they need more than just fixed bus routes as part of their toolkit, which includes, but isn't limited to microtransit. I'm going to be talking specifically about microtransit, but there are other options, of course. So I'll take you through three main reasons why we think microtransit should be deployed to tackle COVID, specifically in rural areas. And this thinking was in part developed in partnership with leading epidemiologists from the UK, actually. So I'll also present a couple of case studies to show how we've used it to tackle COVID in rural and suburban areas. And then I'll finish off by giving you a sneaky glimpse of a free tool we're about to launch, which will essentially help all agencies, big or small, to figure out the steps they need to take to recover as quickly as possible from the crisis. So firstly, microtransit helps agencies to segment their riders because of its app-based technology. So whether by risk profile, they can be determined, you can determine their age roughly, their occupation, depending on the settings you set. And this essentially can be used to help reduce social mixing, which exacerbates the spread of the virus. So Spare's platform allows agencies to prioritize certain trips over others, for example, which means that critical personnel like healthcare workers or vulnerable people, such as seniors, can be preferentially moved over non-essential travelers. And so we've had a lot of interest for this from many of our partners, especially those who have significant senior populations living in more rural areas, for example. Microtransit can also help to decentralize the risk of systems collapsing, whether that be transit or health, if too many drivers become ill, which has been a problem in many cities and in rural areas as well on traditional transit networks. So with microtransit, you have more vehicles with a bigger pool of drivers because you don't have to have specialized drivers, which means if a few drivers become ill, there is backup. The system kind of takes care of itself and it's resilient. This is way more difficult to achieve with fewer trained drivers operating buses on timetables that aren't as flexible to cover each other if one goes down. And finally, we can also use the in-app technology that we've developed to implement contact tracing, which helps us essentially to better understand the spread of the virus and to, if paired properly with the health system, can permit interventions when infections are detected. So we're not proposing this as a solution in all cases. We're very aware that, of course, privacy and security issues to consider, and there has to be a debate around that. So this is on a case-by-case basis, of course, but it's clear that microtransit provides agencies with essentially much more data about mobility and therefore greater oversight about who's sharing vehicles with whom and how contacts might be transferring between riders and with drivers as well. So those 3 points essentially show how microtransit can be harnessed to slow the impact of COVID. What Spare's managed to do really well is to make it an actual tool for emergency response now, because we've shortened our lead to about 48 hours. So cities can go from having an initial conversation about microtransit with one of our growth team to the launch of a service in under 2 days. And in the last few weeks, we've launched half a dozen pandemic-ready transit services in urban and rural areas around the world. But as we've had more and more conversation with transit agencies, both big and small, about implementing microtransit, we've realized that they're looking for something else. It's not just a stopgap solution. They need a guiding hand in analyzing the reams of data that they could possibly be collecting, and crucially, designing a roadmap out of the crisis. So the questions from our clients are not only which interventions they should adopt to stem the ridership decline, but also where they should make them in their city or their village or their towns, and when. Which is why we've developed a new free tool that we'll be publishing at the front and center of our website very soon. So you can see on the slide a matrix that shows ridership decline along the horizontal axis at the top, and then the type of bus line along the vertical axis. So the colors represent the different interventions we'd recommend. So gray, for example, is maintaining the frequency. Don't do anything with your bus line. Green is reducing frequency. Purple is complement a fixed line with microtransit, and blue is replace your line entirely with microtransit. So if you look on the far left at 0% ridership loss, for example, transit agencies are running business as usual because there's no pandemic. But as ridership has been declining and continues to decline, in the example we've got here, it's about 55%. The highest frequency buses in green should probably be reduced in frequency, whereas the lowest frequency buses in blue should be entirely replaced with microtransit. So as ridership begins to recover, the slider moves back up towards the left of the matrix and the interventions change progressively. And we're essentially giving agencies this free planning tool that uses the data from agencies themselves, some of which they might not be aware or actively monitor themselves, and demonstrates to them how to achieve the fastest route back up to recovery. And so there are lots of financial models associated with this that we spell out for them, but it also is a spatial tool that highlights exactly where we'd recommend each intervention in a town or city. So here's an example from Lubbock, a city in Texas with lots of urban sprawl and rural pockets with very poor transit coverage. So the blue and purple lines are the ones that we recommend should be complemented or entirely replaced with microtransit. And this gives planners a really good spatial insight as to where they should be intervening. And finally, the tool then draws in a mixture of transit data and census data to automatically figure out where the best locations for microtransit are. So this analysis, in this case, has pinpointed neighborhoods in Lubbock's rural areas on the fringes of the town that would most benefit from microtransit. A key benefit in this particular case is that it ensures people living in more disconnected areas, especially seniors, won't become isolated from key services as the pandemic progresses because they benefit from this shuttle-based service. And it essentially highlights where an agency and the community as well will get the biggest bang for the taxpayer's buck. This is, of course, a preliminary planning tool. It's not designed to be totally used without concern by agencies, but we found it an immensely valuable tool to kickstart solutions for transit agencies and start conversations, especially smaller ones that are usually under-resourced and don't have the bandwidth to carry out this kind of analysis themselves. So to sum up, I hope I've managed to convince you of these three things. That firstly, the flexible nature of microtransit means it'll help a wider transport network recover much faster by making those networks more efficient, more resilient, and more trustworthy for riders, and that's especially vulnerable groups. Secondly, the advanced algorithms underpin spares and other on-demand technology companies' operations means that agencies can have more oversight over who their riders are and how they travel. And that's important not only now to slow the spread of the disease, but also going forward to ensure transit's accessible to those who need it most. And finally, to ensure that transit is built to last, its planning should really be as data-driven as possible. So we've provided this free tool and others, once agencies come on board as partners with us, that empowers them to make the right decision, especially when they're under pressure.